The smell hit them before the shoreline did. Standing at the rails of the transport ship in the gray pre-dawn hours of August 7, 1942, Private First Class Eugene Sledge later wrote that the smell was like nothing he had encountered in his 19 years of life on Earth. It was not the ocean. It was not rain. It was something older and heavier, something that clung to the humidity and pressed against the skin. It was the smell of a jungle that had already decided it did not want you there. Guadalcanal, an island most of the men aboard that ship had never heard of 3 weeks earlier. An island that appeared on almost no American maps. An island that the Japanese had quietly begun constructing an airfield on, which was precisely why 11,000 United States Marines were now standing at their ship rails, staring into the dark tree line, waiting for the ramps to drop. The men of the 1st Marine Division were not yet legends. They were young, largely untested, drawn from cities and farms across a country still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Many had enlisted in a fury of patriotism following December 7, 1941, driven by rage more than strategy. Their training had been abbreviated by the urgency of war. Some had been in uniform for fewer than 8 months. The Japanese soldiers waiting for them in that jungle were something else entirely. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy landing forces that occupied Guadalcanal in the summer of 1942 were among the most battle-hardened soldiers on Earth. Many had been fighting continuously since the invasion of China in 1937. They had conquered Manchuria, Shanghai, Singapore, the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, and most of Southeast Asia in a span of roughly 5 years. They were disciplined, fanatical, and had won almost every engagement they had fought. Their officers believed, with justification at that point, that the Japanese soldier was the superior warrior in the Pacific theater. What those officers did not fully understand, and would spend the next 3 years learning at catastrophic cost, was that the United States Marine Corps had been quietly engineered for precisely this kind of fight. Not because Marines were inherently braver than other soldiers, though their culture cultivated extraordinary courage. Not because their weapons were more advanced, though American industrial production would eventually overwhelm Japanese logistics. But because of something more specific and more devastating. The Marines had been trained for amphibious warfare, forced to operate in the precise environment where Japanese military doctrine was most rigid and most fragile, and they had developed a psychological and tactical identity that the Japanese could not adapt to, predict, or break. This is the story of why. If you have ever wondered why the Pacific War turned the way it did, this video answers that question at the ground level, one island, one engagement, one Marine at a time. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a video like this one. To understand what made the collision between Japanese forces and the United States Marine Corps so one-sided by the war's midpoint, you need to understand what the Japanese military machine had been built to do, and more importantly, what it had never been designed to handle. The Imperial Japanese Army's tactical doctrine in the early 1940s was built on 3 interlocking pillars. The first was the spirit of Bushido, the warrior code, which held that willingness to die was the supreme military virtue. Officers were trained to believe that spiritual ferocity could overcome material deficits. That a soldier who did not fear death was worth more than one who relied on equipment or fortification. This was not merely propaganda. It was operational doctrine embedded into every level of training and command. The second pillar was the banzai charge. The mass infantry assault, often conducted at night, screaming with bayonets fixed, designed to break the psychological resistance of the enemy through sheer terror and momentum. Against Chinese forces, against British colonial troops in Malaya, against Filipino and American units in the chaotic early days after Pearl Harbor, the banzai charge had worked repeatedly. It had broken defensive lines, collapsed morale, and forced retreats. The third pillar was the assumption of enemy inferiority. Not simply as propaganda, but as a genuine operational assumption built into Japanese planning. Japanese staff officers consistently underestimated American recovery speed, American logistical capacity, and American willingness to absorb casualties and continue fighting. They had watched American and Filipino forces collapse on Bataan. They had watched American forces retreat from Wake Island. They had concluded that the American soldier, comfortable, accustomed to abundance, raised in a soft democracy, would not fight with the same ferocity as a Japanese warrior shaped by decades of militarized nationalism. This assumption was wrong. But it took Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Paliliu, Iwo Jima, and dozens of smaller engagements to prove it, and the proving cost both sides enormously. What the Japanese could not have anticipated was that the force landing on Guadalcanal in August of 1942 was not a typical American unit. The 1st Marine Division was something the Japanese military theorists had never encountered before, because nothing quite like it had ever existed before. The United States Marine Corps had spent the entire decade between the wars doing something unusual for a military organization in peacetime. It had been thinking. Beginning in the late 1920s, Marine Corps officers had studied every major amphibious operation in modern history. Gallipoli, 1915. The disastrous British and Australian landings on the Gallipoli Peninsula during the First World War, where attacking forces had been slaughtered on the beaches by defenders with prepared positions, had become the textbook example of what not to do. The conventional military wisdom following Gallipoli was that large-scale amphibious assaults against defended beaches were essentially suicidal and should not be attempted. The Marine Corps uniquely looked at Gallipoli and drew different conclusions. Major Earl Pete Ellis, one of the most brilliant and unconventional officers in Marine Corps history, had written a classified strategic study in 1921 titled Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia. In it, he had predicted with remarkable accuracy that a future war with Japan would require the United States to conduct a series of amphibious assaults across the Central and Western Pacific. He had outlined the doctrine, the equipment requirements, and the training necessary to make such operations succeed. He had done this 20 years before Pearl Harbor. Ellis died under mysterious circumstances in the Pacific in 1923, possibly while conducting intelligence work on Japanese-held islands. But his ideas survived him and became the foundation of Marine Corps amphibious doctrine. Through the 1930s, the Marine Corps developed what became known as the Fleet Marine Force concept. Marines would serve as the assault element for the Navy, trained specifically to seize defended beaches, establish beachheads, and hold ground under fire until heavier Army forces could be landed. This required a fundamentally different kind of soldier than conventional infantry. It required men who could fight effectively under maximum psychological stress, in unfamiliar terrain with minimal logistical support, against prepared defensive positions, and without the ability to retreat because there was nothing behind them but ocean. The training was designed accordingly. Marine recruit training in the early 1940s was deliberately brutal by the standards of the era. Not randomly brutal, but purposefully designed to identify and eliminate men who would break under pressure, and to forge those who remained into something qualitatively different from the soldiers being produced by the Army's expanded wartime training pipeline. The physical standards were higher. The psychological pressure was sustained and systematic. Drill instructors operated under a doctrine that held that it was better to break a man in training than on a beach in the Pacific. Men who could not withstand the pressure of Paris Island or San Diego would not withstand the pressure of a defended beach. But it was not just the physical and psychological toughening that distinguished Marine training. It was the specific tactical curriculum. Marine infantry in 1942 were trained in something the Army would not fully systematize until later in the war: small unit initiative. The concept was straightforward but had profound operational implications. In the chaos of an amphibious assault where communications broke down, officers were killed, units became separated, and plans dissolved within minutes of contact with the enemy, the ability of a sergeant or corporal to make correct tactical decisions independently was the difference between a beachhead and a disaster. Marine NCOs were trained to assess situations, make decisions, and act without waiting for orders from above. They were expected to understand the commander's intent well enough to improvise toward it when circumstances changed. This was not simply good training. It was a direct counter to the most dangerous aspect of the Japanese tactical system. Japanese infantry doctrine in the early 40s was rigidly hierarchical. Officers planned. Enlisted men executed. Initiative below the officer level was not encouraged and in some cases was considered insubordinate. This created an army of extraordinarily brave and disciplined soldiers who fought magnificently when plans were working and became dangerously brittle when plans fell apart. On Guadalcanal, plans fell apart almost immediately. The initial Marine landing on August 7, 1942 achieved near-complete surprise. The Japanese garrison was small, largely construction workers and a thin screen of naval infantry, and the 1st Marine Division secured the partially completed airfield, which they immediately renamed Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway within the first day of fighting. But the Marines' situation was precarious from the moment they landed. The Navy, alarmed by Japanese air attacks and fearing the loss of its carriers, withdrew the transport fleet on August 9 before the Marines had been fully supplied. 11,000 Marines on Guadalcanal found themselves with approximately 4 days of ammunition, 2 weeks of food, and no naval support. Their commander, Major General Alexander van de Grift, later described the feeling as being dropped in a jungle and told to hold it against the entire Japanese Empire with what was in your pockets. Van de Grift pulled his perimeter tight around Henderson Field. He could not hold the entire island. He had neither the men nor the supplies for that. What he could do was hold the airfield and force the Japanese to come to him. The Japanese High Command's first response to the Marine landing was contemptuous. The 17th Army dispatched a force of 917 men under Colonel Kaineo Ichiki with orders to retake the airfield immediately. Ichiki's force was a detachment of the 28th Infantry Regiment, veterans of battles in China and the fighting in the Aleutians. They were among the finest infantry the Japanese army possessed. Ichiki was so confident that he did not wait for his full force. He had been originally assigned a much larger command but chose to attack immediately with his advance element rather than waiting. His after-action report, which he expected to file from a recaptured Henderson Field, would note that the position had been retaken in a night assault. What Ichiki did not know was that Marine scouts, led by Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, a former member of the Solomon Islands Constabulary who had been captured and tortured by Japanese soldiers and escaped with 6 bayonet wounds to warn the Marines of the approaching force, had already alerted Van de Grift's headquarters to the Japanese advance. The Marines were waiting. At 2 in the morning on August 21, 1942, Ichiki's force charged across the Tenaru River, screaming with bayonets fixed, directly into a Marine position anchored by machine guns, barbed wire, and riflemen who had been ordered to hold their positions regardless of what happened. The Marines held. The banzai charge that had broken so many other forces crashed into a prepared defensive line and was annihilated. Japanese soldiers reached the wire and died on it. They broke through in places and were killed by Marines in hand-to-hand fighting. The machine guns overheated from sustained fire. Marines poured water on them and kept firing. By dawn, Ichiki's force had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Of the 917 men who had attacked, approximately 800 were dead. Ichiki burned his regimental colors and shot himself to avoid capture. The after-action reports filed by Japanese officers who survived or who reconstructed the engagement from prisoner accounts and physical evidence noted something that did not fit their model of American soldiers. The Marines had not broken. They had not retreated. They had absorbed a night assault, taken casualties, and continued fighting until the attacking force was destroyed. This was not the behavior Japanese doctrine had predicted. It was the first indicator that something had changed. It would not be the last. The fight for Henderson Field did not end at the Tenaru. It was only beginning. The Japanese 17th Army, now understanding that this was a serious American effort rather than a raid, began landing reinforcements on Guadalcanal's northwest coast under cover of darkness. The Tokyo Express, as American sailors named it, ran destroyer convoys down the slot between the Solomon Islands almost every night, dropping off men, ammunition, and artillery while the Marines watched from their perimeter and the Navy fought to stop them. By September of 1942, the Japanese had landed approximately 6,000 men under General Kawaguchi, and Kawaguchi was planning a coordinated three-pronged assault on the Marine perimeter. The plan was more sophisticated than Ichiki's frontal charge. Kawaguchi would attack from 3 directions simultaneously, overwhelming the defenders and retaking the airfield in a single night. The terrain Kawaguchi selected for his main assault was what the Marines called the Lunga Ridge, a razorback spur of high ground that offered an approach to Henderson Field through heavy jungle. Kawaguchi believed the jungle would conceal his main force until it was close enough that the Marines would have no time to react. Holding that ridge with approximately 775 Marines was Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. Edson commanded the 1st Raider Battalion, the most experienced small unit fighters in the Marine Corps, veterans of the raid on Makin Island and landing operations at Tulagi. His men had been in continuous combat for weeks. They were exhausted and under strength, but they understood the terrain in a way that Kawaguchi's force, newly arrived and navigating unfamiliar jungle, did not. Edson did something that confused his own officers initially. Rather than position his men along the entire ridge, he pulled them back to a tighter perimeter centered on a small knoll at the ridge's crest. He was deliberately leaving ground that Marines could have held because he wanted Kawaguchi's attack to come to him on ground of Edson's choosing rather than ground of Kawaguchi's choosing. The principle was the same one Juan Pota had applied at the Kagaluan River Bridge. Let the enemy commit to an attack, and use the terrain to turn that commitment against them. On the night of September 12th into September 13th, Kawaguchi's force attacked. What followed became known as the Battle of Bloody Ridge. For 2 nights, Japanese infantry assaulted Edson's position repeatedly, wave after wave, screaming, using the jungle for cover, probing for weak points, attempting to find a gap in the Marine line that would let them pour through and overrun the airfield. Edson walked the ridge during the fighting, calmly directing fire, repositioning men, filling gaps in the line personally. When one sector began to collapse, he moved there himself. Radio reports from Marine units on the ridge that night described conditions that should have been unsurvivable. Artillery fire from both sides falling on the same ground. Marines shooting at shadows that turned out to be Japanese soldiers 10 feet away. Bayonet fighting in the dark. The line bent. It did not break. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi had lost roughly 600 men. The airfield had not been reached. His force was exhausted, low on ammunition, deep in hostile jungle with no resupply route. He ordered a withdrawal. The Marines on Bloody Ridge had held with 775 men against an attacking force of roughly 3,000. Their casualties were 59 killed and 204 wounded. The casualty ratio, roughly 4 Japanese dead for every Marine killed, did not fully capture the operational significance of what had happened. The significance was this. For the second time in less than a month, a Japanese force operating according to Japanese doctrine, attacking with genuine courage and in numbers that should have been overwhelming, had been destroyed by Marines who refused to be broken. Japanese officers analyzing these engagements began writing reports that contained language their headquarters found difficult to accept. The American Marines, these reports noted, fought differently than expected. They did not abandon positions under pressure. They did not panic under night attack. They recovered from losses quickly and continued fighting. They appeared, in the words of one Japanese regimental commander whose assessment survives in captured documents, to have been trained specifically to defeat the tactics we employ. That observation was more accurate than he could have known. Understanding what had made those Marines so difficult to defeat requires understanding the 2 things that Japanese commanders consistently failed to account for in their planning: American small unit resilience and American logistics. The small unit resilience had been built through training, but it had also been reinforced by something cultural within the Marine Corps that is difficult to quantify but impossible to miss in the primary sources. Marines believed, with a conviction that bordered on religion, that they did not leave men behind and they did not leave ground they had been ordered to hold. This was not unique to the Marine Corps. American soldiers shared versions of this ethos. But in the Marines it had been elevated to an institutional identity. A Marine who abandoned a position or left a wounded man in the field was not simply making a tactical error. He was betraying something fundamental about what it meant to be a Marine. The social and institutional pressure against breaking was extraordinary. Japanese officers who examined Marine positions after engagements repeatedly noted that Marines had fought to the last man in situations where rational military calculation would have dictated retreat. At Guadalcanal, on Tarawa, on Peleliu, the pattern appeared again and again. Marine units reduced to fractions of their original strength continued holding positions against attacks that outnumbered them by ratios that should have been decisive. The Japanese understood bravery. Their own soldiers were extraordinarily brave. What they could not model was a bravery that expressed itself not as the willingness to die in a charge, but as the willingness to hold ground in a fighting hole while the person next to you died and the next wave was already coming. These were different things. Bushido romanticized the offensive death. Marine Corps culture, almost paradoxically given its aggressive reputation, had been structured around the defensive hold. The Corps had been founded on the premise that its job was to take ground that could not be taken and hold ground that could not be held. That institutional memory shaped how its men fought. The logistics dimension was equally significant and arguably more decisive over the course of the campaign. When the Navy pulled the transport ships from Guadalcanal in August, the 1st Marine Division had been left with roughly 60 days of half rations. They supplemented this with captured Japanese rice, jungle fruit, and whatever could be flown in by the handful of aircraft operating from Henderson Field. Marines lost an average of 12 to 15 pounds during the first 2 months of the campaign. Malaria infection rates exceeded 75% by October. By November, units were reporting that fewer than half their men were fit for combat at any given time due to disease alone. And they held. The Japanese, meanwhile, were suffering a logistical collapse that their commanders initially refused to acknowledge. The Tokyo Express could deliver men. It could not consistently deliver food, medicine, or heavy equipment in the quantities needed to sustain the Force 17th Army was accumulating on the island. By October and November, Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were starving. Not the restricted rations that Americans found demoralizing. Actual starvation, men subsisting on handfuls of rice per day, then on grass and roots. The disparity in what the two nations could sustain a soldier with, even when the supply chain was under maximum pressure, reflected the fundamental industrial imbalance between the United States and Japan. American industry had been converting to war production since early 1941. Japanese industry had been on a war footing for years but lacked the raw material base to sustain it. The difference was visible in individual soldiers. American Marines on Guadalcanal were hungry, sick, and exhausted. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal, by the campaign's end, were dying of malnutrition faster than they were dying in combat. A Japanese Army report from November 1942, recovered after the war, estimated that of the 30,000 Japanese soldiers who had served on Guadalcanal over the course of the campaign, approximately 5,000 had been killed in action. Approximately 9,000 had died of disease or starvation. The remainder were evacuated in late January and early February 1943, many so weakened that they could not walk unassisted. The Americans had not simply outfought the Japanese on Guadalcanal. They had outlasted them. And outlasting them had been possible because even in the most constrained supply conditions the Pacific Campaign produced, American Marines received more food, more medicine, more ammunition, and more reinforcement than Japanese forces could receive. This was not an accident. It was the output of an industrial economy committed to a war it intended to win, being channeled through a military branch that had spent 20 years thinking about how to fight in exactly this environment. The Japanese High Command formally ordered the evacuation of Guadalcanal on December 31, 1942. The evacuation was completed in early February of 1943. The 6-month campaign had cost the Japanese Navy 2 battleships, 1 fleet carrier, 3 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, and over 800 aircraft. The cost to Japanese Army strength was 38,000 men killed, wounded, or dead from disease. It had been the first Allied land victory against Japanese forces in the Pacific. It would not be the last. But the nature of that victory contained lessons that Japanese commanders struggled to absorb, because absorbing them would have required acknowledging that the fundamental assumptions underlying Japanese military doctrine were wrong. The assumption that spiritual ferocity could overcome material deficit had not held at Guadalcanal. It had not held at the Tenaru. It had not held on Bloody Ridge. It had produced extraordinary acts of individual bravery that the Marines who fought there acknowledged and respected even while killing the men who performed them. But bravery expressed through banzai charges into prepared positions had not translated into tactical success. The assumption that American soldiers would not fight with Japanese intensity had been decisively disproven. The Marines had fought with an intensity that Japanese veterans who survived Guadalcanal consistently described as beyond anything they had anticipated. And the assumption that the American logistical system could not sustain forces deep in the Pacific had underestimated American industrial capacity so severely that the error was, in retrospect, catastrophic. What Guadalcanal established, what the Marines proved in those 6 months in the jungle, was a template that would play out again and again across the Central and Western Pacific for the next 3 years. Japanese forces would defend. Marines would assault. The Japanese would fight with extraordinary courage. The Marines would fight with extraordinary persistence. And the logistical and material weight of the United States would, engagement by engagement, island by island, tip the balance. The specifics would vary. The terrain would change. The tactics would evolve. But the fundamental dynamic, the reason Japanese forces struggled most when they faced the Marines specifically, was established in that jungle in the summer and fall of 1942. And to understand how far that dynamic had progressed, how completely the equation had inverted from the confident Japanese offensives of 1941, you need to look at what happened 2 years later, on a small volcanic island 8 miles long and 4 miles wide, 660 miles south of Tokyo. The island the Japanese called Ioto. The island the Marines would make famous under another name. Iwo Jima. The story of what happened on that island, and why it became the defining test of everything the Marine Corps had built, is coming up immediately after this. If this kind of deep historical storytelling is what you came here for, subscribing takes 3 seconds and it helps this channel more than you know. By February of 1945, the Japanese High Command had learned a great deal about how Marines fought. The problem was that learning had not translated into a method of defeating them. It had translated, instead, into a philosophy of how to die while inflicting maximum casualties. This shift in Japanese strategic thinking, from the confident offensive of 1941 to the defensive attrition doctrine of 1944 and 45, represented one of the most significant psychological transformations of the war. And it was largely a transformation produced by repeated contact with the Marine Corps. The architect of Iwo Jima's defense was Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi. He was not a typical Japanese officer in several respects. He had served as a military attaché in the United States in the late 1920s and early 30s, had traveled extensively in North America, and had written letters home to his family that expressed a clear-eyed assessment of American industrial and military potential. He had warned, years before Pearl Harbor, that a war with the United States would be extraordinarily difficult to win. By 1944, winning was no longer Kurabayashi's objective. His objective was to make the Marines pay such a severe price for Iwo Jima that the American public and American military planners would reconsider the invasion of the Japanese home islands. He understood that no defense he constructed could stop the Marines indefinitely. He was trying to raise the cost high enough to matter politically and strategically. His defensive plan was a direct response to everything the Marines had done since Guadalcanal. The beach defenses were minimized. Kurabayashi had studied Marine amphibious assaults on Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, and Peleliu. He had concluded that trying to destroy the Marines at the waterline was futile. American naval gunfire and air support during the landing phase was too overwhelming. The beach defenders died quickly and accomplished little. So Kurabayashi pulled his forces back from the beach and built his defense underground. The island contained volcanic rock that could be excavated into a honeycomb of tunnels and bunkers connected by 11 miles of passageways. Kurabayashi deployed 21,000 Japanese soldiers underground, in positions that could withstand naval bombardment, connected so that if one position was taken, defenders could fall back to the next and the next and the next. The entire island was pre-registered for artillery and mortar fire. Every approach had been surveyed. Every kill zone had been calculated. The plan was to let the Marines land, draw them inland, and then destroy them with fire from positions they could not easily locate and could not suppress with the weapons they would have available. It was the most sophisticated Japanese defensive system of the Pacific War, and it had been designed specifically by a man who had studied the Marine Corps and understood what he was facing. The Marines landing on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945 included the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions. Approximately 70,000 Marines total, the largest force of Marines assembled for a single operation to that point in the war. They had been briefed that the island would likely be secured in 3 to 5 days. It took 36 days. The first hours after landing were disorienting in a way that veteran Marines later said was unlike anything they had experienced before. The beach was black volcanic ash that swallowed ankles with each step, slowing movement to a crawl. The terrain offered no natural cover, and for the first 30 minutes nothing fired at them. The silence was worse than fire. Then Kurabayashi's plan activated. Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened from positions that were nearly invisible. Men died without ever seeing what was killing them. The black sand offered no cover and no concealment. Marines were hit before they had moved 20 yards from the waterline. Sergeant John Basilone, the most decorated Marine enlisted man of the war, recipient of the Medal of Honor for his actions on Guadalcanal, where he had held a machine gun position through the night assault, killed in action on the beach within the first hours of the landing. His death captured something about Iwo Jima that the casualty statistics alone could not convey. This was not a place where any individual Marine's skill or experience could guarantee survival. This was a place that was designed to kill Marines systematically. But the Marines kept coming. What happened over the next 36 days was the final and most extreme demonstration of the dynamic that had been established on Guadalcanal. The Marines had been trained to do something that very few military forces in history had been designed to do. Advance through fire that should be stopping them, under conditions that should be breaking them, toward positions that every tactical calculation said could not be taken, and keep advancing until those positions were taken. Kuribayashi's tunnels and bunkers created a problem that Marine small unit tactics had to solve in real time, because no pre-battle planning could have accounted for the specific layout of defenses that were invisible until you were standing on top of them. The solution that emerged, improvised by Marine NCOs and junior officers under fire, was a combination of flamethrowers, demolitions, and what Marine veterans of the campaign described simply as persistence. A flamethrower team would approach a bunker. One man operated the weapon. 2 or 3 others provided rifle cover, because the flamethrower operator was drawing fire from every Japanese position in range. The flame was pushed into the bunker's aperture. The defenders inside, if any survived, would attempt to escape through the tunnel system. Marines covering the other apertures would kill them as they emerged. Then they moved to the next bunker, and the next. For 36 days. The Marines took Suribachi on the 5th day, the famous flag-raising photographed by Joe Rosenthal providing an image of triumph that the island's continuing resistance immediately complicated. Taking Suribachi had been extraordinarily difficult. It represented roughly 5% of the island's defended area. The remaining fighting was worse. The Japanese in Kuribayashi's central and northern defensive network fought from positions that artillery could not destroy, that bombs could barely affect, that could only be taken by men on foot moving close enough to use demolitions and fire. Every day produced casualties that would have ended other campaigns. The 4th Marine Division, which landed on the right flank, suffered casualties exceeding 60% over the course of the battle. What kept the Marines advancing under those conditions was something that Japanese doctrine, even in its revised defensive form, could not model. It was not blind courage. It was not indifference to death. It was a peculiar combination of institutional identity, small unit cohesion, and mission focus that expressed itself, in the words of numerous Iwo Jima veterans interviewed after the war, as simply the inability to leave the man next to you to die without moving forward. The Marines did not advance on Iwo Jima because they were unafraid. They advanced because stopping meant the man to their left and the man to their right were more likely to die, and that was something Marine culture had made nearly unacceptable at an emotional level. This was the thing Kuribayashi's planning, for all its sophistication and genuine insight into Marine tactics, could not counter. He could design defenses that maximized Marine casualties. He could not design defenses that made Marines stop. Kuribayashi himself communicated with Tokyo throughout the battle, his messages becoming more reflective and more admiring of his enemy as the weeks passed. In one of his final communications, recovered after the war, he described the Marines as adversaries of the highest quality and noted that their perseverance under fire exceeded anything in his experience or study. He died, almost certainly in one of the final Gyokusai charges on the night of March 25th into March 26th, leading what remained of his garrison in a final assault on Marine and Army Air Corps positions near the island's northern airfields. The attack was repulsed. Kuribayashi's body was never definitively identified. Iwo Jima was declared secure on March 26, 1945. The Marines had suffered 6,821 killed and 19,217 wounded. Total Marine casualties exceeded 26,000 men on an island 8 miles long. Admiral Chester Nimitz, in his public commendation of the Marines who fought there, wrote a sentence that became one of the most quoted observations of the Pacific War. Uncommon valor was a common virtue. The Japanese garrison of approximately 21,000 had suffered 20,000 killed. Approximately 217 were taken prisoner, most of them wounded and unconscious when captured. The remainder died on the island or by suicide. The ratio of defenders killed to attackers killed at Iwo Jima was roughly 3-1, meaning the Marines, attacking a prepared defensive system, had still killed 3 Japanese soldiers for every Marine who died. This was the reality underneath the casualty numbers that tend to dominate accounts of the battle. Iwo Jima was costly for the Marines. It was annihilating for the Japanese. The reasons for that ratio were not primarily about courage. Both sides had demonstrated extraordinary courage on Iwo Jima, courage that was documented, witnessed, and acknowledged by opponents as well as comrades. The reasons were about what each side had been built to do and how well it was built to do it. The Marines had been built to take defended positions. Everything about their training, their equipment, their organizational doctrine, and their institutional culture pointed toward that specific mission. The Japanese had been built, in their 1945 configuration, to die defending a position. Kurabayashi had been explicit about this in his orders to his garrison. There would be no evacuation. There would be no surrender. Each man would kill 10 Americans before dying. The mathematics of that exchange, however calculated by a commander with Kurabayashi's clear-headedness, should have told him something. If the goal was to kill enough Marines to deter the home island invasion, and if the price of that deterrence was the annihilation of every defender on the island, then the exchange ratio needed to be higher than 3 Marines per 10 Japanese defenders. It needed to be closer to the reverse. It never came close to the reverse. Not at Iwo Jima. Not anywhere in the Pacific. And the reason it never came close was the thing that had been established on Guadalcanal 3 years earlier and refined on every island in between. Japanese forces, regardless of how well they were commanded, how well they were positioned, or how bravely they fought, struggled most against the Marines because the Marines had been specifically designed for the one kind of warfare that Japanese military doctrine, in both its offensive and defensive forms, could not consistently defeat. The United States Marine Corps had been designed to take islands. Japan had islands to defend. The matchup was, from the beginning, more one-sided than it appeared. The last Marine combat action against Japanese forces in the Pacific occurred in August of 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan's announcement of surrender. Marines participated in the occupation of Japan beginning in late August, landing at Yokosuka Naval Base as part of the initial occupation force. The reception was not hostile. Japanese civilians and soldiers had been told to expect American barbarism. What they encountered was, by most accounts, professional and disciplined behavior from occupation forces. Some Japanese veterans later described their surprise at the contrast between what they had been told to expect and what they experienced. This too reflected something about the Marine Corps institution. It had been built for a specific mission, and when that mission was accomplished, it was capable of functioning in an entirely different mode without the institutional confusion that might have been expected. The veterans of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima returned home to a country that understood, in the broadest terms, that the Marines had fought in the Pacific and that the Pacific had been won. The specifics of what had made the Marines specifically dangerous to Japanese doctrine, the interplay of training, institutional culture, logistics, and small unit tactics that had turned island after island from Japanese strongholds into American airfields, were less immediately visible in the public understanding of the war. The men who had fought understood it. The Japanese officers who had faced them understood it. And the military historians and planners who studied the campaign in the decades that followed understood it with increasing clarity as primary sources, Japanese as well as American, became available for analysis. What those sources revealed was a story about institutions as much as individuals. About what happens when a military organization spends 20 years thinking carefully about one problem. About what happens when that problem turns out to be exactly the problem that history presents. The Marines had predicted, prepared for, and ultimately solved the specific tactical challenge of amphibious assault against prepared Japanese positions in the Pacific. They had done it at extraordinary cost, in places and conditions that should not have been survivable, with men who had been turned into something their enemy could not break. General Kurabayashi had seen it clearly from his tunnels on Iwo Jima. The Marines were built for this. Understanding that, and being unable to do anything about it, was the most honest tribute a defeated commander could give. Sergeant James Basilone, Eugene Sledge, Merritt Edson, the men of Bloody Ridge, the men who crossed the Tenarue in the dark and held the line when the Banzai waves came, the men who cleared bunkers one by one for 36 days on 8 miles of black volcanic ash. They were not simply brave men who happened to be Marines. They were the product of 20 years of institutional thinking by people who understood that the Pacific War was coming before most of the world believed it, and who had decided to be ready for it. That readiness cost them dearly on islands most of the world had never heard of. It also won the Pacific. If this story gave you something, leave a comment below with the name of a Marine, a battle, or a Pacific story you want covered next. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment, because the next video goes even deeper.